everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States and Canada with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you hear from throughout our series year-round. Today, we are so excited to have comedian, screenwriter, filmmaker, and author Jena Friedman with us to talk about her new essay collection, Not Funny, Essays on Life, Comedy, Culture, etc. Hi, Jena, how are you?
I'm good. Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. And I want to get started, but I want to pause and kind of give everybody that standard housekeeping information that lets everything run more smoothly throughout our talk. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we, as always, will be taking your additional questions throughout the conversation. So when you have a direct question for Jena, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream video at any time to submit that question. In addition, if you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours, and in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Jena Friedman is a comedian, filmmaker, and creator of AMC's Indefensible and Soft Focus with Jena Friedman on Adult Swim. She has worked on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, Late Show with David Letterman, and her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, ArtNet, and The Guardian. She was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay and won a Writers Guild of America Award for her work on Borat Subsequent Moviefilm. She splits her time between Los Angeles and New York, and you can find out a lot more about Jena at jenafriedman.com. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How have you been? How are things going?
I'm good. I have a baby in the other room in case you guys hear him cry or laugh or just make noise. But things are good in LA at the moment. On strike with a bunch of writers. I can answer any questions about that if anyone has them, in addition to talking about my book if we have time. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I likewise have a baby in the other room, so could be dueling babies if they start making noise. So I'm just going to jump right in with maybe an awkward question, because I'm not sure if you know Maureen, but Maureen says, not a question, rather a compliment. I'm so proud of you. As a young girl growing up near our home on Colonial Ridge Drive, you showed great promise, and I look forward to hearing you speak to the Haddonfield Library.
Oh, hi, Haddonfield Library. I'm going to cry. Oh, that's so sweet. Yes, Haddonfield was where I grew up, and it's a very formative part of my life. I do talk a little bit about it in the book, not too much. But thank you, Maureen.
So can you, for the viewers who haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, can you talk a little bit about your book, your collection of essays?
Yes, absolutely. First, Tara, I don't know when the strike is going to end. I think it's going to be a long strike. But back to my book. It is a series of essays. I remember when I was first writing the book, I read a bunch of other memoirs by comedians, particularly female comedians. And I remember reading Bossy Pants and just really rereading it because I'd read it when it first came out and just really appreciating the chapters about work and Lorne Michaels and Tina Fey at SNL. And I just thought that in the book that I was going to write, I wanted to do the same. I wanted to make it autobiographical, but also really focus on my experience working more so than on my personal life. So that was just in the back of my head. And then I started writing essays about my 15 years in comedy, and it kind of took a shape that way. It's part memoir, part book about comedy and work. And then I have some fun with some particular chapters, like one where I ask a bunch of my favorite male comedians questions that female comedians have gotten. That's a chapter that I think a lot of people appreciate. And then, yeah, it's just kind of been, I'm only halfway down my career or like a third of the way down my career. So it's not like a full on memoir, but it has elements of that.
Okay. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how the book came to fruition? I think I read somewhere it was a tweet.
It was, oh yeah. So I had tweeted something that people found offensive. It was a joke about it was right before the Republican National Convention. I saw that this couple, they were the McCluskeys, they were famous for pointing a gun at protesters that they were speaking at the RNC. And so I was just on Twitter. This was during the pandemic. And I just tweeted something like, breaking news, Brock Turner speaking at the RNC. And a lot of people thought that that was real. And a Stanford professor weighed in and said, like, comedian's tweet is not funny. And the victim in the Brock Turner case, her lit agent who had reached out to me prior, reached out to me and said, just want you to know, we all appreciate you getting his name trending because her book is on sale now, and it actually will bring more visibility to her story. And I thought that was incredibly bizarre. But then he was like, would you want to write a book now? And it was, I think, around the time of the Delta variant. And so I've been doing comedy for so long, and it takes so much focus to write a book. And I had been distracted with other projects. And this was the first time that I thought, you know what, I have the time. And I also feel like I finally have something really substantive to say from experience. So it just, those kinds of things aligned, but it was pretty bizarre how it happened. It's also such a crazy time that like a tweet that was clearly satirical would go viral and have all these people thinking it was real, and that the issue would be the comedian's tweet, as opposed to the fact that we live in a society where people would conceivably think that a sex offender would be speaking at a national convention. I just felt like we were in this really weird time, and I had a lot to say about that too. So I just wanted to kind of put it all down on paper in book form.
And so Sarah's asking if you could tell us a bit about the title to your book, Not Funny. It sounds like maybe it was it because of that Stanford professor? Like
partly because I have this, I was on Colbert talking about this, so I feel cheesy doing it again. But yeah, this Stanford professor weighed in and said, comedians tweets, not funny, but also not funny. I personally have always been like, when I would walk into the Comedy Cellar, if I were to perform on a show that night, they would think I was the girlfriend as opposed to the comedian. I think for a lot of female comics, the term not funny, it's like this kind of specter in our careers where the worst heckle you can ever get is someone saying, you're not funny. And I just thought it would be a really funny title for a book. And then also for people who think I'm not funny, if they type in my name and not funny, the first thing now that comes up is a link to my book. So
yeah. That's smart. So Erin would like to know, how is it different to write a book on your own compared to like working on skits and staff writing? And which do you prefer?
So when you're working for someone else, you really have to kind of filter what you think is funny through what they think is funny. And there's always a little bit of a Venn diagram. When I was working on Letterman, he definitely had a comedic sensibility, and then this was my comedic sensibility, but we had a small intersection. And that's kind of, when you're writing for them, you're trying to thread the needle and like find out where your comedy hits their comedic sensibility. When I worked on The Daily Show, that Venn diagram was a lot closer, and Jon and I have a very similar comedic sensibility to Jon, so it was an easier job. And same with Sacha Baron Cohen. When I worked for Sacha, maybe we're a little different, but a lot of similarities there. And then when I write for myself, it's really just kind of, with this book, I've done so much comedy and I do stand up. I didn't feel like I had to have this book be funny. But I do think the way that I see the world is maybe through like a comedic lens. So it has comedic elements to it, but I think essay writing is scarier to me than joke writing, because there's a vulnerability to that. So I do think it was harder to write the book than it is to work on any of those shows. It's also more collaborative. When you're writing a book, it's very solitary, and you don't know how people are going to react to it until it's out there.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine that writing stand-up is probably more akin to writing essays as far as vulnerability goes. Is that?
Well, you're physically vulnerable because you're physically on stage where anyone can find you, which is terrifying. But when I write, a lot of times I'll write my jokes on stage. So I'll come on stage with a premise and I'll kind of work it out. And then I'll do another show where the joke will just kind of write itself and just get tighter. And and so audiences are really much a part of my process of how I craft stand-up material to an extent. I don't not clearly not all my jokes are crowd pleasers, otherwise more of you would know who I am. But when I with the book, it's again, you're not crowdsourcing it. You're really just it's just you. Now there was the chapter, for example, about the question when I ask male comedians questions that female comics have gotten. I did take to Twitter and I said, hey, female comedian friends, send me some questions you've gotten. And for some of the really egregious questions, I actually sourced them because I wanted to make sure that people knew that these were actual questions that we've gotten and not just me pretending to ask questions that female comics might get.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of back up a little bit because we did have a lot of people ask about how you got into comedy, and you open your book kind of introducing us to that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I got into comedy. It's so dorky. It was through a paper that I wrote in college about comedy. But if any of you have done improv, it is the gateway drug to comedy. It's so addictive. And now it's a little bit of a punchline. It's kind of cheesy, but I got into improv in 2003-4 when I was researching my senior thesis, and I just fell in love with it. And as I was living in that world under the guise of research, I just knew pretty quickly that I wanted to try to find a way to keep doing that. And so that's how I got into it. And I write about it in the book. It was a crazy journey. I'm looking at some of the questions. Do you sense that with the polarization of opinion and reluctance to appreciate subtlety, we're unable to appreciate irony these days? I don't know. I don't know, Frederick. You have 3 questions. Whoa. Okay, more questions.
Oh no, Frederick is posting them. The names are before
them.
Yeah.
Okay.
The names are before the question.
Gotcha. When writing a collection of essays, how do you decide when you've written enough? Or that the number, well, I had a word count. It was 60,000 words. So I was just trying to get to that point. And then I was about to go into production on Indefensible. So there is one chapter where I was just like, I'm going to repurpose some old sex questions because I got to get this draft in. And my editor did say, he was like, you're very few writers get their books in on time. So I did get it in on time. But there are so many stories that are, that I've left on the cutting room floor, which is not a term that you use in writing, that hopefully I'll get to write another book and put those in there. If you guys buy this book, I'll get to write another one. But okay. How did I know when I was done? I think the last essay that I wrote was about the Oscars, and that was the most recent thing that had happened to me. And it was kind of about the idea of making it. And I think that was a good ending to the book. I was curious if you feel that your inclination towards dark humor has helped prepare you for helping us laugh through these bleak times. Patrick, that only you can answer that. I make myself laugh. I don't know. I think I sadly think the times have caught up to me. My comedy used to be dark, but the times are just dark at this point. So I think my comedy is just baseline. I don't know, catharsis.
Yeah, I could see that. Cygnus is asking a pre-submitted question about teachers that you've had throughout your life. I guess maybe whether they're comedic mentors or actual teachers. And you kind of approach those topics in the book a little bit, especially with the high school teacher and then like a favorite college teacher. So who were some of these teachers and who were your favorite and most meaningful throughout your education?
I mentioned Michaela DiLeonardo at Northwestern. She taught radical feminist politics, feminist Marxist anthropology. And so, and I say this in the book, but she gave this really great anecdote that just has stuck with me forever about how when she was little, her friend's mom bought her a class to learn how to draw. And so she got really into the class, and after a few weeks, she started seeing everything in terms of how she would draw it. Like she'd look at a tree and she wouldn't just see a tree. She'd see a series of pencil lines of how to render that tree on paper. And so when she was teaching us feminist Marxist anthropology, she would say, you're not going to just see this pocket of society that you're looking at. You're going to see race, class, and gender and the political economy and how that factors into it, which sounds very mouthy or heady or intellectual, but that's really what happened to me. I was studying female comedians, and all of a sudden I was looking at this long form Chicago style improv as really a reflection of societal shifts and inequalities. And that is the least funny way to enter into a career of comedy. Also, why I called the book Not Funny. But she was really impactful to me. And then I mentioned a teacher that I had in high school who was a creative writing teacher. And it's tricky to talk about that out loud, which is why I appreciate writing about it. But he was a good teacher. And it came out after I graduated that he had an affair with a student who was a few years older than me. And she wrote about it pretty eloquently. And I think the Boston Globe a couple years ago. But that, having had that same teacher and writing a book about art, feminist issues, misogyny, the kind of barriers to enter a creative profession, that essay felt like something that I really wanted to include in the book, because even though it wasn't really about my journey in comedy, it is about the kind of mentor teacher and how they impact young voices, or how they silence or discourage young voices. And so, yeah, that teacher didn't have as much of an impact on me, but I thought that story was important to tell in the collection of essays.
Well, then you move right into the American Girl dolls and like their impact on young children. And when I was reading about your American Girl dolls parody musical journey, first I was so sad because I was living in Chicago when that was on, and my roommate was even a stage manager at the Apollo Theater in Lincoln Park, and I had no idea.
Well, I was doing my own PR, so you probably wouldn't have known. I had no budget when I put that show up.
But so can you talk about the American Girl dolls parody and your drive to see it through, and how it ended up being received both times that it was, or in both cities that it was featured?
So I'll answer your question as I'm also multitasking. No, I was never the class clown growing up. I was, in my high school yearbook, I was worst driver and biggest flirt, which is, I was not a flirt. And that's those two, that combination. I don't know why I'm still alive, but do I have a favorite joke? Sure. But to answer your question, Brendan, about the American Girl dolls. So I was writing on a political sketch show in Chicago. It was around the time, I think 2005, American Girl got in trouble because their doll of the year, Marisol Luna, fled her dangerous neighborhood of Pilsen and moved to Downers Grove, which was a Chicago suburb. This was in her backstory. And the people of Pilsen, which is this very proud Mexican-American enclave in Chicago, were furious. They protested American Girl. I had heard about this. I thought it was not hilarious, but that this doll company was so tone deaf that made me laugh. I went to check out the place, and it became this muse for me, because the original American Girl dolls, it started as this company that was to teach little girls about history, and then Mattel bought it, and it became this crazy, huge corporation, and like this corporate enterprise. And they had all these different dolls from different periods of American history. One was a runaway slave. The only Black doll in the collection was a runaway slave. The doll from the Depression era came with accessories that cost more than she had like a toy broom that cost more than a real one. And so the political sketch show that I was writing on, I had a sketch every week where I created this kind of garbage pail kid version of American Girl called the Refugee Girls. It was like American Girl launches this new refugee collection. And so every week I had a different refugee. And the comedy was always like punching up. So we were never making fun of the girls, but just the company commodifying their experiences. And then when I realized that American Girl had a show, I went to see it. It was one of those things where I just was like, I have to parody this. So with the help of 12 brilliant comedian friends of mine, we put up this show in Chicago. I was 23 when I wrote it and produced it. I had no budget. My friends were all doing this for free, just out of the love of this. It was like this edgy political satire. And we put it up at the Apollo Theater, which would have technically been our workshop, but we just put it up. I had no idea. I just did this. and it got critically panned by Time Out Chicago. On a funny side note, they would not let us put the Time Out Chicago review in the book. We had to put like a condensed version of the review. And Time Out Chicago Comedy called it the worst comedic attempt of 2007. And that was not even a category in the magazine. They created that category for us. I was so depressed when that happened. I was so sad and depressed. The whole show was kind of ended up being really hard to pull off because we got that review early on and then we had 8 more weeks and my cast was so sweet, but somebody definitely dropped out. And one show I had to step in for her and just something was a mess. And then at some point I submitted the script to the New York Fringe. I found out months later that we got in. I met with the cast to see if they wanted to reboot the play in New York. We did. The only change was that we actually brought on a director instead of me telling my friends what to do, which didn't really work out. We brought on a real director. We tweaked the final song to just lean into the satire. And the show in New York got 4 stars in Time Out New York. So it was a really cool story that I've never talked about except in book form. Sorry, that's my dog. And it was such an interesting lesson in satire, how when you present something to the world like that, you have to make sure that it's bulletproof, which is a phrase I should probably stop with the gun jargon, but it was just a really interesting lesson of how to successfully do satire. You can't apologize. You have to make sure, there will be criticism coming at you, especially if you have a political point of view. And just how to be and how to make your work. Teflon tough. Teflon's also problematic. Whatever the cliche is, and it's so funny that what
ironclad, maybe
ironclad, sure. But then just to go from that experience to then working at the Daily Show and working for Sasha, it is interesting how that was my first project out of the gate. That was like really a passion project of mine. And just the experiences of being in Chicago versus New York and doing that show. I don't know. So I'm glad I got to write about it.
Do you think that gave you a good foundation for Soft Focus?
Which was my Adult Swim project. Nobody saw. That's incredible. That was my dream show. Yeah. I mean, I think getting eviscerated at 23 and being like the laughing stock of your little comedy scene because you got 1 star from some angry theater critic who criticized the set design. And then still deciding to continue on doing comedy. I mean, I don't think it'll ever be as hard for me, hopefully, as it was then when nobody knew who I was. And I was just trying to put up this show with my friends. And so, yeah, everything I've done since has been easier.
Well, Seth says you are so brave to take on political issues, helping to keep us all sane. What advice do you have for the rest of us who feel afraid to take on people who are anti-women, anti-feminism, anti-environment, etc.?
I would say donate to people doing the work. I think like one of my, I think reproductive rights are really important. If you're afraid, but you believe that people should have freedom to make their own healthcare decisions, donate to organizations on the ground doing the work. That's my only advice. I mean, and also vote and tell everyone, to vote, because we're in this moment where if you look at the majority of Americans want people to be able to make reproductive healthcare decisions on their own, not get shot in public or private, have clean water. The majority of us, regardless of your politics, all believe pretty similar things, but we just have these kind of relics of an antiquated system like the Electoral College, and there's gerrymandering, and there's so many obstacles at our ability to have a democratic country. So I think continuing to vote, and then in any way that you can support people who are actually on the ground doing the work. That's my only advice.
Yeah. So you mentioned reproductive rights, and you have
your local libraries. Okay, keep going.
and I mean, it's in your book, so we have to kind of dive into it. Your section on dead baby jokes, your essay on dead baby jokes, or DBJs for short. Introduce that DBJs can be like on a sort of spectrum, those that are told by adolescents, those kind of somewhere in between, and those that are more advanced and political focusing and kind of skewed toward about abortion and miscarriage. Basically, anything that about the female experience that can make people uncomfortable. So, can you talk a little bit about that and how you use it as a political tool?
Yeah, so I don't know why I was always into dead baby jokes as a kid. They're just these shocking, gross, creepy jokes. And as I kind of thought, how did I start doing comedy? Where did this all come from? I had this flash of me being a kid telling these jokes to my friends, specifically down the shore. If anyone's from New Jersey, I have this memory of just being down the shore and people were telling jokes that I just like felt were problematic or racist or exclusionary. And I just started telling dead baby jokes and I kind of creep people out, but dead baby jokes were these like equal opportunity offenders. And I talk about the actual like structure of that type of a joke being a really good like training wheel for other jokes, because it's really just like you have your setup and you have your punchline, and it doesn't matter what your punchline is. The subject matter is so shocking that any punchline will work. So in the shock value of those jokes, it kind of teaches you how to get a laugh, for better or for worse. And then as I was like tracking my own career, when I started writing my own jokes, a lot of the jokes I started writing were abortion jokes. And I just kind of looked at abortion jokes as like, adult dead baby jokes. But then also it's a little problematic as I'm saying it out loud because like fetuses aren't babies and yada, yada. Sorry. I don't know if anyone's tuned out. Sorry. But yeah, that chapter, I think that was the first chapter of the book that I wrote. It definitely was this like weirdly academic. I put on my anthropology hat and it was like kind of this like academic analysis of dark humor and this specific joke and then how it kind of related to my journey as a joke writer.
There's some great sources in that chapter. It was a good chapter.
Cool.
So you also told some jokes about miscarriages while you were pregnant. Is that right?
Yeah, I had one joke specifically, and I don't want to tell the joke here. It's not even a joke, but I had a joke about miscarriages because like once I turned 30 something, all my friends were having miscarriages and nobody talked about this. And they were feeling so upset and alone and freaked out. But then when they realized that it was like this common experience, it contextualized it in a different way. And I think it made people feel less alone and less freaked out and less scared about it. And it's kind of like it's one of those things that we're not talking about it, but we should. And we kind of have to be, because now they're legislating it. And now like you could have a miscarriage and all of a sudden that's a crime scene in some states. So my favorite things to joke about are the things that are taboo, but things that we have to be joking about and that we have to be talking about. On a side note, the period dance scene in Borat, that was like a perfect intersection of my comedy and Sasha's comedy. And periods are totally natural and normal, but it's like this taboo thing that nobody talks about.
Or a medical offense on Letterman.
Yeah. When I first got into comedy, I couldn't make a period joke on Letterman. But with the miscarriage joke, it was really interesting because it's a creepy joke and there's shock value to it. And I have had people at shows be upset about like after I tell the joke. And I mean, they're going to a comedy club. You have to have a little bit of a thick skin. And also the joke is not mean spirited. If anything, it's hoping and trying to bring something that is stigmatized out into the open to make people feel less alone and to talk about. But then when I actually physically became pregnant and visibly pregnant, all of a sudden the joke that was already a groaner really stopped working. And that to me is like my favorite place to mine comedy, because I know the joke works. I know the audience is just freaked out because I'm pregnant. And so I just kind of added more tags onto the joke. Like, if you don't laugh, you're going to stress out the baby. And yes, people got uncomfortable, but that is a comedy that I like to do. Because if you want to just laugh, there are chat bots that can help you do that. But if you want to groan and be creeped out, that's where I come in. That's a comedy that I like to do. I like to kind of prod my audience and kind of tease them and play with them a little bit, as opposed to just make them laugh. When you've been doing comedy long enough, you know what makes people laugh. It's often a dick joke, but it makes people laugh. But to make people kind of like groan or like curl up in disgust, that to me is art. That's what I like to do.
Yeah, leave people thinking. So Lois wants to know, with your friends, have you gotten yourself in a tough spot because of your humor? And how did you unwind the issue? This kind of makes me think of the essay about Mike DiStefano.
Oh, Mike DiStefano.
Yeah.
He was a comedian, so I mean, he never was weird about my jokes. He just called me. I talked about it in the book. He just called me and we had a nice conversation. No, I mean, I think my friends a lot of them are comedians, and the ones who aren't, they get the memo. I mean, we all have things we're sensitive about that are hard to talk about, but I think a lot of the people that I gravitate towards and a lot of comedians, you kind of face those things head on. And I think as long as you're not making fun of someone or doing it in a way that's mean-spirited. I definitely got in trouble with men I was dating early on who like didn't get my comedy, or like, I definitely had experiences where I would tell a joke on stage, or I would, tell a joke off stage, and it just didn't land, or there were sensitivities. I don't know. But with friends, I think my friends kind of know who I am and the intent behind the things that I say. And I haven't really gotten in much trouble in that department.
That's good. What about with your family? Your mom, you talk about a video that your mom begged you to take down.
And I took it down. And if I left it up, maybe, who knows what would have happened. But I've been careful with my family a little bit. I don't really talk about them on stage. My comedy, I think the stuff I'm working on now is probably going to be more personal, but previously, and I talk about this in the book, my comedy has been more outward and more political. In 2015, there weren't a lot of people doing that kind of stuff. And now I think we have so much Trump fatigue. We have so much politics fatigue. It doesn't feel like there's really anything left to say comedically. So I do think I'm probably moving a little more inward to be about my personal life.
Mm-hmm. Mary would like to know how you got your first job writing comedy. And to piggyback on that, Dana is saying, how did you get the showbiz powers that be to talk with you and even look at your work?
Well, so my first like big comedy job was writing for Letterman. I had been doing stand-up, and through stand-up, I kind of connected to a community of people in New York, and I had done stand-up in Chicago, so I had a community there. And I also produced my own show in New York, which is like a live free show once a week in Brooklyn. And that's how I met people. So when you start to do comedy, there is a community of people, and that's kind of how you learn about jobs and stuff. But I had opened for Jeff Garlin. I talk about that in the book. And his manager had seen me perform. And then they submitted me to write for Letterman. And then they dropped me. And then like a month or a week later, I forget exactly, the Letterman staffers asked to see another packet of mine, and I wrote it, and then I ended up getting the job. So a lot of it in entertainment, a lot of it is luck. It's also timing. It's also talent, and then all the things kind of converging at the same time, or just not being unlucky. There are a lot of factors. When I first moved to New York, I had a cousin who owned a bar, and I was able to bartend at his bar while I was, doing a bunch of odd jobs. And it's a crazy industry, and it's only getting crazier. And I have the sign because I was striking today. Like, I don't know if you guys are following what's going on with the writer's strike, but it's what's happening in almost every industry, where the middle class workers are really just kind of being squeezed out by big tech and changes in that space. And so as hard as it was for me to be a comedian and a writer back then, I was able to work for Letterman and make money on residuals and get Writers Guild health insurance from that job. That was 2011. So I'd been like 4 years into doing comedy when I got that job. And those kinds of jobs are increasingly hard because there are fewer late night shows. The studios are trying to make late night writing spots like gig like day player spots as opposed to like salaried positions. It's a crazy industry now more than
Yeah.
ever.
Well, and streaming kind of it disrupts those residuals, right? So
Streaming disrupts residuals is a big part of it. The whole AI thing, which a lot of people find really confusing. AI is never going to replace writers, but what it's going to do is it's going to allow studios to not pay writers for original material and then call us in to punch it up. Also, AI should refer to like the Chat GPT as like plagiarism machines, because those technologies use existing content. That's where they get their content. So it's not like this like magic robot. It's actually machines based off of pre-existing content writers have already made, that are still prone to error. And there was an article, this is a whole side note, but I think in time it came out that like ChatGPT has like farms of laborers in places like Africa working for very low wages to try to make ChatGPT less problematic. And so those kinds of things are still relying on human labor, but just in countries where they have even fewer protections. So, and this happened with like cabs and Uber coming in, and this is happening in every industry, but the Writers Guild and the DGA and SAG, we are a consolidated union in an industry where we actually do have power. So we're really pushing to try to, protect middle-class workers and wages. And it's not just about, I know that for people who are on the coast, it seems like coastal elites just like marching for residuals, but it's about so much more than that. And I really hope
it affects people. I mean, just for some context for people viewing, it affects people across the country. My husband, I live in New Orleans. He works in the film industry. There's no work because everybody's on strike right now. So it affects everybody across the board. But it's a good strike to have. There's a good reason for it. So it's necessary.
Yeah. Jonathan, is it true that comedy is one of the hardest genres to write about, regardless of the medium you use it for? I don't know. I mean, I think comedy can be hard, but I don't know. I grew up in a family where my mom was the funniest person I know without even knowing it. So I think I just have her comedic sensibility ingrained in my mind. I mean, is comedy hard to write about? I don't know. I'm not a comedy critic, but you should ask Jason Zinnemann at the New York Times, who writes about comedy. He makes it seem easy. I don't know if that was your question, but.
Okay, so you talked about how getting some of these jobs, a lot of it is luck, but there's a big essay right in the middle of your book where you talk a lot about likability. And so how hard likability is to achieve and to keep it once you have it. And that sounds like a lot of pressure to carry with you all the time. So can you talk about how likability has or even still does manifest for you?
Yeah. So our industry, and I think, my hope with the book is that the essays, even though they're about comedy, which I do think is an industry that piques a lot of people's curiosities, that the themes of the essays resonate with every industry. That is my hope. And I couldn't talk about my experiences in comedy without talking about likability, which is this elusive kind of thing that you either have or you don't have or whatever. My first experience even hearing the term was I had a manager tell me that what makes or breaks a successful comedian is whether or not they are likable. And then that same manager fired me for not being likable. And likability for female comics particularly is this kind of specter that haunts your whole career, whether you're auditioning for a role or performing in front of an audience or working in a writer's room. Whether or not you are likable is really like a ticket to your success. The problem is there's no answer. It's completely subjective. It's completely beyond your control. And I do think when I turned 30, and I talk about this in the book, I just stopped worrying about being likable because you can't worry about something you can't control, then you'll just be miserable. So, yeah, I actually have been bonding with female comedians recently because we're all sharing these stories. And there was this one booker that I don't mention his name, But he booked this very big comedy festival that really made a lot of careers. And he had this unwritten rule that if you went on stage as a female comic and you were wearing high-heeled boots, he would just tune out and not, even if you were hilarious, he would not book you. And when people have rules like that, it puts into a stark view how hard it is for any of us to be seen for our work and who we are as opposed to what we look like. And so yeah, I mean, a lot has been written on likability, and I tried to pull from that when writing that essay, but I also based it on my own experiences. And I do believe that things have changed for the better in that regard. I think because of the work that women who came before me have done and how outspoken they've been about inequalities and injustices in our industry, and just with the changing times and the activism that has been tied to those times, things have definitely gotten better. I don't think that there's the same pressure on young women to be as likable as there was when I was first coming up. Also, there are just more platforms. There's TikTok. There's all sorts of different podcasts where you can, if you want to do what I do, you can kind of carve out your own way and not rely on the gatekeepers who have arbitrary notions of what's likable and what's not likable to either hurt you or help you succeed.
Are there any particular essays that you wrote that are your favorites or that you found particularly cathartic?
The American Girl one was definitely cathartic. The likability essay, I think there was an audition that I had that I like looked through my old emails and dusted off, and I put that whole audition in the book. And it's one of the fun, just rereading that and being like, oh my God, I can't believe the week that I submitted to write for Letterman, I was sent out on an audition for a character called Girl Having Sex, who had one line in a studio feature where she was topless and humping some guy. And so I did some live shows to promote the book, and my friends and I kind of made fun of that. It was pretty fun. And then also the chapter where I got to call my favorite male comics and ask them really silly questions. That was really fun. I'm sorry if you hear my son in the background squealing.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out if it was my daughter outside, and I was like, I need to go help. But that's okay. So what do you hope that people take away from your book, from your story, from your essay?
Wow, that was great. I want to buy another copy for my niece. I just want to be able to keep writing. I really enjoyed the process, and I hope that I had never written a book before. I hope that it makes people feel less crazy and less alone. And I wish that I had read a book like this before I started out in comedy. I do think I've gotten feedback from men too that they have appreciated the kind of window into the not quite Me Too gray area subtleties of, being in the workforce. Yeah, I just hope people enjoy it. I don't have any expectations other than that.
Okay, thank you. So we have quite a few questions, just like general questions for you that aren't completely centered on your book, but still, kind of have threads tangled in there a little bit. Rose is saying sometimes women of color can find discussions of feminism exclusive to white women or irrelevant to their experiences as people dealing with sexism and racism. How does your work take into consideration the history, experiences, and concerns of women of color?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I write what I know, and I only speak from like my vantage point as like, a white woman in this industry. When I was coming up, my thesis was about white women's experiences and how they compared to men and women in the same community who are not white. So I had the privilege of talking to many, many performers in Chicago who are not white, who talked to me about their experiences, trying to work in Chicago improv and their experiences being tokenized on stage, and the freedom that they found working outside of that system. And so that was my entry into this world was very much like intersectional feminism, looking at race, class, and gender in the political economy. Again, that's not funny, but that has kind of impacted the way that I work and the comedy that I do. But again, I am a white woman, and so, and I definitely have some privileges, many privileges in that experience. Um, one of which is, doing the prank stuff that I do. I find it really interesting. Like, I interview a lot of creepy men, and I think because I'm like a white lady who looks like, Anne Romney, people don't take me seriously, or they don't think I'm trying to mess with them, or they don't think I'm funny. And I think there's power in that. And when I was at the Daily Show as a producer, I was able to kind of use the way that I look to disarm interview subjects. In one particular case where Asif Mamvi was a correspondent, the segment was on voting rights, and the racist Republican guy who we interviewed didn't want to speak to Asif, and that's my son. I was able to get him to trust me and partake in the interview, and he said some really awful stuff, and he ended up getting fired from his position. So, I try to be conscious of, how I look and how that informs the work that I do. And then when I'm working on projects, I try to bring in voices of people that don't look like me or have my background to help make the work better. That's how I roll with this. But I do think that it has, this little pocket of our, as the world is on fire, this little pocket of our society, like kind of comedy, in some ways has really gotten a lot better and a lot more inclusive, and a lot more people who don't look like me or who don't look like white guys are getting paid, and they're having their voices out there. And up until the writer's strike, it felt like progress has been made in this part of our society. And I write about that in the book as well.
We do have quite a few people asking about how you think our humor has changed in our culture over the past decades. Yeah. And Bradley's saying specifically, what factors do you think contribute most to those changes in humor?
Well, I mean, I think it takes more than decades for comedy to change, but there definitely has been like a shift in, I think people it's tricky because I think there's that whole cancel culture conversation where people are like, you can't say this anymore, you can't say that. I talk about that in the book. That was the hardest chapter to write because because the term cancel culture is so nebulous itself. And I talk about all the reasons why in there. And I also try to always remind people that comedians have been arrested and in prison. Lenny Bruce, Mae West, George Carlin, in eras before cancel culture. So, that's one thing. I don't ascribe to the idea that you can't joke about anything. I think you can joke about anything you want as long as it's coming from a place of humanity. I think our culture, the changes over the past decade, there are definitely things that have gone out of style. There was like this trend of like ironic racism among like hipster comedians in the mid like 2005 to 2010, that a lot of those, Sarah Silverman show is a perfect example. Sarah Silverman is one of my favorite comedians. And, in comedy, I think you have to sometimes cross the line to know where it is. And there were a lot of risks that, she took on that show in particular that she's since walked back on. And so, a lot of comedy changes with the times. If you look at Blazing Saddles now, a lot of things didn't hold up. So I think comedy changes with the culture. I also appreciate comedy in the UK because they have a darker sensibility. I think because they've been around so much longer and they've had, live performance art and comedy so baked into their culture. So when I perform over there, their sensibilities are even darker. Whereas like in the US, kind of people, I think we're a little bit more naive, less so now than we were 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. But I think we have the Hollywood movies and we have these happy endings. And I think we are like a younger culture than in other countries. And I think our comedic tastes reflect that, but it is changing really quickly, unfortunately.
So Francis is saying the skill of making people laugh at the unfunny is a priceless skill and seems to be something that you either have or you don't. But do you think that people can learn to do this? Francis continues, many times comics have helped me survive these stupid and bizarre times with a good laugh. How do you do it? How do they do it? Can it be learned?
I think that my son is hopefully okay. He sounds like a bird trapped in a well. I don't know. I don't know. I worked really hard. I think stand up in particular, you're not really funny right out of the gate. It's very humbling. Even the best, even Jerry Seinfeld has bombed on shows. Um, I think it can definitely be learned. I think it's so much more your perseverance and then your innate talent, because there are so many things working against every single person in this industry, and you just have to kind of keep at it, and it's just really hard. But yeah, I think it can be learned. I think a chatbot can. There's this argument now where they're like, AI can't write comedy, and people are posting like sample AI scripts of shows, and I in my mind, because I wrote on a network show, I'm like, that's better than a first draft of the show that I worked on. So if AI can learn to be funny, so can you, is my point.
So, with that, Renee wants to know what strategies you use to remember your content without notes on stage.
I still have notes on stage, and I have like mommy brain, so I'm a mess. But um it's like memorizing a song or anything. But yeah, even when I have a stand-up special that came out on Peacock when I was very, very pregnant, and I just had a prompter in the back.
Okay. So, Bruce and Deborah are asking, what do you do when you tell a joke or a funny story that fails to receive an appreciative response from your audience? And Wendy says, how do you handle hecklers if that's what it causes?
Well, hecklers are almost better than like just the silence of a joke not working. Because with a heckler, you can at least distract yourself, and there's something to like them breaking the decorum of seeing a comedian do a show where the audience will get back on your side if you have a heckler. But yeah, I mean, you just have to kind of either make a joke about the fact that the joke didn't work or muscle through. I've had that happen a lot.
So, what do you, because I know in the book you talk about a couple of moments where you were heckled, one in which you just ran off the stage, but that was pretty early in your career, right?
That was very early. There was this show called Kitty Moon in Chicago. And I talk about this in the book also, but the guy who booked the show was actually a registered sex offender. But he was like the most encouraging of all the women in the scene. And it was other comics you may know, Cameron Esposito and Beth Stelling and I all came up in Chicago at the same time. And these shows were the only shows that we had access to. And as a young comic, the one thing that will get you better is stage time. And so the irony is that he was like, not like I shouldn't get into this, but the sexual offense, so I heard, wasn't anything to the level of what Trump would do. It was more just kind of like a creepy, gropey thing that he did when he was 18. Anyway, this was a person that supported new talent in Chicago. When I told my mom I wanted to do stand up, this is why she cried, not even knowing the reality of what I was up against. So at that show, yeah, there was some guy who said like some creepy sexual remark, and he was like, "Give me a blowjob" or something, and I just walked off stage. But at that same show, I don't know if this was before or after, I also got my wallet stolen out of my bag, so that hurt more.
Oh, no. Yeah, that would hurt.
But these are the things that if you can survive these things early on, then nothing is worse. Bombing on stage is not worse than bombing and getting your wallet stolen.
Yeah, that's true. I agree. I mean, I've never done stand up, so I guess I can't completely commiserate, but that would be horrible. So you mentioned that that Sarah Silverman's one of your favorite comedians. Stephanie wants to know, what other comedians do you most admire?
I mean, there are too many to list. Patty Harrison is actually one of my favorite comics, who's I don't think she's under the radar now because she's been in a lot of movies, but consistently one of the funniest people if you ever have a chance to see her live. Lisa Traeger is another comic I think is just so funny all the time. Naomi Ekperigin is another comic I find hilarious all the time. full disclosure, I am lucky to call these people friends also. But I have a ton of, there are a ton of comedians. Nathan Fielder, I mean, not as a stand-up, but his work, he's just another level of genius that anytime he has a project, I just can't wait to see it. Those are a few of the people that I love.
In your book, you tell this wonderful story about randomly meeting Robin Williams and inviting him to a show. And you say that to this day, it was still one of the best live performances you've ever seen. Is that still true?
Mm-hmm. It was wild. It was wild. He performed for about 80 or 90, 23 to like 25-year-olds at a bar. And I think he was in a weird place because he had just gotten divorced. And we all just loved him. And I had seen him do shows in a bigger theater because he was prepping for his hour. And he was doing kind of like topical jokes that maybe, I don't want to say hacky, but just more topical jokes. And then when he performed for us, he was just really unfiltered and honest. And it was so cool to see him perform for an hour. I think he improvised the whole set, and it was just like watching him, just the best magician do magic. That's what it felt like.
It's pretty cool. It's really cool. So after this entire conversation, Jess wants to know, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Oh my God. That's the worst question ever. What do you want to do for money? Like, are you my mom? No. I just want to be able to keep doing this. And that honestly, I don't know how many people are watching this, but if all of you right now bought my book on Amazon, I would be able to write another one. So that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an author and be on this for my next book because you all so kindly 1 to 2 copies.
1 to 2 copies.
I'm saying 2. No, 1 copy. It's not a cheap book.
1 copy will suffice. So do you have other plans in the mix then for writing?
Well, I'm doing shows in Portland. I'm trying to get back into stand-up. I don't want to get back into stand-up. I want to be writing, but we're on strike and it's going to be for a while. So I'm getting back on the stand-up wagon. And whether I'm funny or not yet, at some point I'm going to be funny. That's how it works. Yeah, so I'm getting back into stand-up. I had a couple projects going, but we are pens down with the writer's strike. So yeah.
Okay. Well, the last question that I love to ask everybody is, what books do you love or are you reading right now that you recommend that everybody goes out to their library and checks out immediately?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, I just read Maggie Smith's new book. That was really good.
Yeah. I can't think of the name right now either, but I know what you're talking about.
You Can Make This Place Beautiful or something. I don't know. It's a divorce memoir and I'm happily married. So I had to like hide it from my husband as I was reading it. I'm like, this has nothing to do with you. It's just really well written. My friend Bess Kalb has a book that's hilarious. It's called Nobody Will Tell You This But Me. It's about her relationship with her grandmother, and it's beautifully written. What other books? I'm looking at the books on my desk that I haven't finished or read yet. I'm about to read Anne Elizabeth Moore's Sweet Little Cunt. I haven't read that yet, but I met her at a thing and she was really cool. Yeah.
Okay. That'll do. Thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour, so time flies. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. It's seriously been a pleasure talking with you for the last hour.
Oh, you too. It flew by. And thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it. I hope this was fun.
It was fun. I mean, it was fun for me. With that, oh, sorry, go ahead. I keep interrupting you.
No, you don't. I was like, that's all that matters. As long as it was, worth your time, Brandon.
Oh, it definitely was worth my time. When your next book comes out, I'll have to invite you back. So with that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to the Author Talk today. Without your support, none of this would even be possible. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Below the live stream video, You can find a link to Jenna's book. So like she said, go buy 2 or 7
I'm
copies.
sorry I said 2 copies. I know times are tight. It was just a response to what do you want to do when you grow up. I'm like, I want to keep writing books.
Oh, there's my child now. We look forward to seeing you all next week on May 20th when we chat with New York Times bestselling YA author Courtney Summers about her most recent book, I'm the Girl. You can register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us and have a good evening.
Thanks, guys.